in spirit and prayer.
Welcome, Sister Jo Robson. I am delighted to be able to interview you today.
Thank you.
A member of the Carmelite community at Ware, England since 2000. You have a special interest in the writings and teachings of Saint Teresa of Avila and have published articles on this topic in a number of spiritual and academic journals. You are currently coordinator for the Initial Formation Program for Carmelite Sisters in the UK, as well as being a member of the editorial team for the magazine Mount Carmel. It's an impressive resume.
Keeps me busy.
So our focus today is on prayer. I'm curious to learn more about your home religious community in Ware, England, and the daily structure of its life of prayer. Could you share a bit more on that, please?
Yes, of course. So we're a Carmelite community. We belong to the Carmelite order as 11 sisters here. And our life is purely contemplative. So we don't have an active apostolate. We don't have activities that we go outside of the monastery to do. And therefore, that means we can focus our lives on prayer. It becomes the reason that we're here. But obviously, there's all the ordinary activities of daily life that any of us have to do. So we structure our day around those duties, the duties of work, and the duties of prayer. In terms of prayer, we focus on two kinds of prayer. The solitary, silent prayer that Saint Teresa was so famous for advocating. And we have two chunks of that in a day. So one in the morning when we first get up, and then one around 5 o'clock in the evening. And then we complement that kind of prayer with liturgical prayer. So the prayer of the church, the divine office, Vespers, Lauds, Compline, and obviously, of course, Mass. So there's a sort of balance that we try to achieve between work and prayer, and between the different kinds of prayer.
That sounds like a full, rich prayer life. And it's clear to me that the Carmelite spirituality has contributed so much to the church. In what ways has Saint Teresa's legacy or influence affected the understanding of different aspects of your prayer life?
I mean, obviously, Teresa's a kind of master of prayer and a huge figure in the Christian tradition. And, you know, it's a huge privilege to live the life that she devised for us, really, that she marked out for us. I think Teresa's message about prayer really essentially boils down to some very simple teachings. And the first one, the one that she really wants us to grasp, is that prayer is for everybody. You know, it's not some esoteric activity for a specialist few. Prayer is for everyone. And more importantly than just saying that, interior prayer is for everyone. So here a bit of context is important. Teresa herself was living in the 16th century at a time when the church was very anxious about lay people in particular, and especially lay women, engaging in interior or mental prayer. And they were really worried that people were being led astray by this kind of praying, and encouraging women and lay people in general to restrict their prayer to vocal prayer, to saying the rosary, to reciting vocal prayers, attending Mass and receiving the sacraments, but basically saying that anything beyond that, you were starting to dabble with stuff that could go seriously wrong or lead you astray. And Teresa was having in her own prayer life some quite remarkable experiences, and was very anxious about those, anxious about whether they were from God or from the devil. And what she came to realize was that they were from God, that they were a gift to her, and that they were for everybody. And that's really her great message. Not that we should all aim to be having great mystical experiences, but that we should all set out on this great adventure of prayer, because that was the way to meet and to find God. And I think within that insight of Teresa, the second thing to say is that she wants to really demystify prayer, if that doesn't sound too contradictory. Teresa comes to understand that any kind of interior prayer is really just about friendship. It's about friendship with Christ. And that's it. And that however that friendship develops, whatever you do to enhance or foster that friendship is good and is prayer. So I think for Teresa, she's on a mission to make prayer accessible. If you put it in sort of 21st century parlance, she wants prayer for everybody. And I think if I wanted to extend that a bit further, her other kind of revolutionary insight is that the sort of prayer that we engage in as sisters and as priests, that sort of silent, and lay people obviously, that silent prayer, that contemplation, is not just about ourselves. It's at the service of the church and of the world. So that when we step back from the world into the monastic life, the Carmelite life, we're not really just doing it for ourselves. We're doing it as a service to the church and to the world. So it's in that sense, it's a very outward looking kind of prayer.
That's very interesting. That strikes me as being central to the Carmelite way of life, and to really nurture that sense of interior prayer while still being in community.
Mm-hmm.
So and you mentioned this about being in service to the church, but what are some other benefits that you see of this interior prayer life, this value on silence?
Well, silence is something we struggle with. And I think that's, in a way, that's good, because it's something the world struggles with as well. I mean, there can be a sort of expectation that the monastic life is full of silence, that we've somehow taken a vow of silence, and that we live in this sort of tranquil idyll. And if only that was so. Yeah, there's plenty of noise in a monastery, especially when you get a load of nuns chatting. One of the gifts of Teresa's understanding of our life is that normal life, ordinary life, the life that you and I, all of us lead, is the place where we find God. So she didn't want a very rarefied way of living. She didn't want a way of life that was out of touch with what normal people do. She wanted us to live together, to work together, to eat together, to do the things that ordinary people have to do, but to find that it's in those very things that we can meet God. That it's not about necessarily going off into the desert or doing something very abstract. It's about finding God in the ordinary things of life. And I think that's part of Teresa's gift to the church, is to say, look, normal life is where God is. So if you're in normal life, that's where you'll find God too.
There's something so beautiful and accessible, no matter what our starting point is in our prayer life.
Mm-hmm.
And ground ourselves, sort of root ourselves in that, the God is found in the everyday.
That's right.
Really, really meaningful. I'm just thinking, what struck me though is your comment about our great challenge in today's world to be comfortable with silence.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to learn more about Saint Teresa's prayer of quiet. Does this sort of give us a roadmap for how we can establish more comfort with silence or nurture that in our day-to-day lives?
I think she'd see the prayer of quiet. I think the terminology can lead us astray a bit, because when she talks about the prayer of quiet, she's not really talking about silence so much. She's talking about a kind of interior silence in a way. One of the things that Teresa was very familiar with from years and years of experience of trying to pray herself, was the sheer effort of it and the amount of struggle that we have to engage in to try and focus our minds and our heart and our attention on God. You know, that you sit down to pray and suddenly you've got a list as long as your arm of all the things you haven't done, all the things you'd like to do tomorrow, and all the things you really have to do before you go to bed and all the rest of it. And Teresa knew that struggle from the inside. And she knew that the early stages of prayer was about the human effort to try and still the mind down, to stop engaging with those distractions and that interior noise, those voices that say, oh, but you haven't done this and you haven't done that. And what's really encouraging in Teresa's understanding of prayer, I think, is that struggle to bring oneself to silence and to recollection is prayer. It doesn't feel like prayer because it feels like what you need to do before you pray. But for Teresa, she would very firmly say that all those efforts by ourselves are prayer. Her prayer of quiet is kind of the next stage. And it's the stage where God takes over the process. So God steps in and says, look, you're never going to achieve this by yourself. You know, you're going to have to let me in a bit. And for Teresa, the prayer of quiet is that moment in prayer where we're given a level of stillness, a level of quietness, where those distractions dissipate and go away, and where we find that almost without us achieving it, well, definitely without us achieving it ourselves, our hearts have become fixed on God. And that may only be for a moment. And it may only be for the last, you've got an hour of prayer, and in the 59th minute, this prayer of quiet is given to you. But that is for Teresa, God stepping in and giving us that first, what Teresa would call a supernatural gift of prayer, where God is giving us the prayer rather than us kind of dragging ourselves up by our bootstraps. And Teresa very encouragingly says, just as we'll all know those early struggling stages of prayer, many, many, many of us will be given the prayer of quiet, that God will gift us with those very brief moments sometimes of just knowing that our hearts are in the right place and that God is with us.
I think that was so beautifully said, Sister Jo. There's something so human in that, where I think sometimes we have this tendency to wait for the big moments of prayer, these, epiphanies from God, but it's just bringing all of ourselves, all of our doubts and our worries, and exercising or cultivating a prayer life so we can get to those moments where we have the gift of the prayer of quiet.
That's right. It's about giving God the space to work.
Exactly. Yeah. And so would you consider that dynamic of giving space of God the space to work? Mm-hmm. Would you consider that to be one of the greatest challenges today in developing prayer, especially when out in the world?
Yes, I think it is one of the biggest challenges for all of us, whether we're in the world or not in the world, for cultivating a place where we can pray. I'd want to qualify that a bit, though, by saying that I think it's always been one of the biggest obstacles to prayer. I think it was the obstacle that Teresa knew, and it's the obstacle that people before Teresa knew. It's not as if human nature has undergone some kind of radical change in the last 500 years. We're human, and the problems that prevent us or make it difficult for us to pray are the problems that all humans have always had with praying. That need to detach oneself from the world and from its noisiness and from its bustle, that the risk that one takes when one sits in silence and has to confront who one really is. And Teresa talks a lot about self-knowledge and the self-knowledge that arises out of silence, that we're confronted with some pretty unappealing facts about ourselves. That's why we have noise, because it's it's much more comfortable than silence. That struggle in silence to fix our heart on God. You know, why is it that when I sit down to pray, just about anything is more interesting than God? You know, just about anything I could be doing would be more appealing than trying to pray. And Teresa knew that. Teresa talks about, you know, sitting in prayer and just waiting for the bell to ring and wishing the hour were over. And the other thing Teresa talks about in prayer, that one of the challenges in her time, and especially in ours, is that challenge to see ourselves in communion, so that when I am in silence, in prayer, on my own, in solitude, I'm not on my own. It's not just about me. It's about the people I bring to prayer. It's about the people I stand in solidarity with in prayer. It's about the people I intercede for in prayer. So it's not just about the me of prayer, it's about the communion of prayer. And as I say, I think all of those things that emerge in silence are challenges, but they've always been challenges for Christians, for anybody trying to pray. Maybe where our world makes it more of a challenge is some of the aspects, like, for instance, social media, and that sort of additional need to turn off the phone, switch off the radio, not worry about the fact that your WhatsApp has just pinged and there's some appealing message from somebody. So there are things that enhance those difficulties, but those difficulties are perennial to human nature, I think.
I agree. That's very astute, especially if we can feel intimidated by going deeper in our prayer life.
Mm-hmm.
So we can accept that those challenges have always existed. They may just reappear in different ways. And so as we conclude, you've given us so much and to reflect on. Do you have any final words of wisdom if someone came to you and asked, you know, how do I, with the inspiration of Saint Teresa, how do I go deeper in my prayer life and maybe practice some self-compassion for the starting point?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say?
I think Teresa would say that the desire to begin, she says somewhere something like, as soon as you've desired to begin to pray, you've already gone an awful long way. That a lot of the work has been done with that desire, and thereafter it's about having the courage and the confidence to let God in and to hand over the process to him, because he's waiting for you, and she just wants everybody to experience God in that vivid, personal way that she did. So I think she would say, you know, there's a wonderful relationship for you in prayer, and go for it.
Thank you so much, Sister Jill. That's an encouraging message, and I've learned a lot from you today. You are so down to earth and gracious in your approach. So
that's Teresa.
Wise words you've shared. Thank you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.